Hello and welcome back to the Spellmonger universe with what may be the most divisive book in the entire series.
Help him. Go on over and help him.
My name is Sean and today we are getting into book 4 of the Spellmonger universe, Magi. Now let me start out by saying that I am a fan of this book. I don't think I have read many Spellmonger books that I can remember ever truly disliking, but for some reason this book really triggers a lot of people for many different reasons. You got the magic red pill, you have teenaged angst, you have not one, but 2 coming of age stories. All the things that I find kind of interesting and definitely applaud the risk taking in implementing those, but not everyone's cup of tea. But we will be talking all about that a bit later, but first let me give you a bit of an outline of this video. So to get things started, I wanted to start out with my general spoiler-free thoughts, dive into the book spoilers specifically, getting into different sections of the book, kind of swapping between Tyndall and Ron's POVs. And coming back after editing quite a bit of this video already, I decided that I'm actually not going to tie this book into series spoilers like I normally do. We'll do that in the next few books, but for this book I think it expands the world more than it foreshadows the future, so I'll be leaving that out of this video. As of editing, it's already 20 minutes long. Trying to keep it a little more succinct, but back to you, Past Sean. But to start out with my general thoughts that are spoiler-free about the book itself. I think the main reason a lot of people dislike this book is that Terry has mentioned in one of his blog posts that he likes to play around with a lot of genres. So each different book kind of does a different slice of different genres, and as you go further down into the series, you're not going to see the same thing over and over and over again. Instead, you're going to see little slices of this mixed with little bits of that, and for some people, they don't want anything new, they just want the same thing repeated over and over again. If you were a fan up to this point merely because you really liked Min's POV and what was happening with that civilization building and progression fantasy side of it, well, this has a lot of similar elements that you had in the other previous books, but it is kind of different. Later on in the series, you're going to see that with more POVs that I won't spoil now, but I think first of all, there are certain readers that want to see the same thing over and over and over again, in which case that this series may not be the one for you. It's not the same simple gameplay loop. You're going to see certain books that are all action and other ones that are going to be all progression building. And you're going to dive into the other side characters, build up the world a little bit more, and do some more swashbuckling things. So just a heads up, this will not be the first time that this happens. Now, the other thing that I think that turns a lot of people off, and I have seen this repeatedly in the Spellmonger like Facebook community groups and occasionally on the Discords, but because you're doing a coming of age of 2 separate teenager stories, that's a lot of teenage angst to cram into one story.
And I'd like you to get the fuck out of here. Get out of here.
Most of the conflict and character development is what you'd expect of a teenager, and that could be, depending on where you're at in life, very infuriating, or it could be interesting. I know some people who are like in their 40s and 50s that are big fans of this book, so for them to go back into that is something that they probably don't relate with, or they have way too much relation with because they have teenagers at home, so they're already frustrated with that. I still enjoy it. I love a good coming of age story, but I can understand where some people would get upset and not really appreciate that, or just find it to be a bit much. But overall, I think that this book does an excellent job at what it's meant to do. I think by diving into the POVs of Minilin's 2 apprentices, you're able to actually build up the world in a way that's not kind of slogging the rest of everything down. And while this was not a full type of Hogwarts book where we spent the entire book just locked in schooling or locked in kind of the military academy, you do get to actually see the characters go through that and start to expand out that world a little bit that you wouldn't have gotten naturally without having to do some more flashbacks, which the series has a lot of to begin with, but I don't think they're overbearing. But I think if we had done this through Min's perspective, it would have been a bit much. And lastly, and I think this is where this book really excels and what made it very exciting for me, is that up until now we have seen Menelin grow a lot of power, gain a lot of influence, just become almost this mythic figure in the universe already. It's gonna get way crazier later on, but up until this point, almost reestablished the Magocracy, got rid of the censorate, he has built a whole new class of nobility, and we've all experienced through his perspective, which to be fair is pretty laid back and pretty witty. So when we take a step back and actually get to experience this universe through completely new perspectives, I think it puts a whole new spin on everything. For one, you get to see what it's like for people who are in his wake and as apprentices of him, Tyndall and Rondell. You get to see how that much power accrued over one person actually affects the world shape around him and how that affects those people around him. The fact that they have to be sent off and put through these artificial rigors just to be held to the same kind of standard or the same upbringing that they would have had normally, you wouldn't necessarily have gotten that through Min's perspective. You would have gotten Min's perspective, who had that original upbringing. So I think exploring the world through the younger views of these characters was a pretty cool thing. Not to mention just kind of seeing how they're getting pulled left and right with these different political intrigues, and just in general seeing how the world has like been so crazily altered by the passage of events up until now, and just kind of seeing what these traditional academies and institutions were like going into it now. All that being said, you can still fully enjoy the Spellmonger series without really diving too deep in this book. I do recommend still picking it up because a lot of stuff happens that will be critical later on down the plot, but then realize that we're not going to have the same sort of coming of age, at least up until book 14 again. So the characters will be back to more mature rounding, while you will get different POVs. There won't be this teenage angst trying to become mature adults, although there is the Hawk Maiden series, which I cannot speak for because I have not read it, but I guess if you avoid that, then you're good. Had a minor plumbing event where I had to leave mid-recording, so excuse me for the change of clothes, and I also got tired of my office layout, so we changed some things around. But getting into book spoilers. Like I said earlier, I was a big fan of this book. I think there were strong points and weak points, but I think overall I rather enjoyed Rondell's perspective more, or I saw more growth with Rondell than I think I did with Tyndall. A lot of things that happen in this book, it's broken up into 4, maybe 5 major parts, with like the beginning and the end being lumped as a total part. But basically the boys have been just moping around the castle, being teenagers gifted with ungodly power, position, and their master is way too just busy trying to save the world and keep everything glued together to really give them a good education, or personally make sure that they were able to become the mature men that they need to be in order to help him. He has very few people he can trust, and he has a lot of things he needs to do, so having Tyndall and Rondell at each other's throats, just being general mopey, angsty teenagers, is the worst thing that we can have for the realm at the moment, so he devises a plan to fix it. Now, the other parts of this book involve trying to round out their magical education by sending them to an Aryan academy. They have been too busy fighting off goblins and dragons to really see where they are and pass the exams that they would hold to a certain standard of an Aryan or different magical academies. They need to actually get the soldiery experience of the war magic college. They need to go learn what it actually means to be a knight's Magi and learn the arts of chivalry from Sire K, and then they need to throw all that out and see if they can actually function as a unit on their own without direct supervision from Menelin. You switch back and forth between Tyndall and Rondell's POVs, and I think overall I probably enjoyed Rondell's perspective a bit more with this, but I think he also had the most to grow in this book. Tyndall, I'm sure people have met Tyndalls before. You have that arrogant, overly confident, brash asshole, but as long as he's on your side, he's that lovable asshole that just is a blast to be around. My experience being in the military was that I met a lot of Tyndalls before, and once you get over the fact that you can't take a lot of what they say seriously, they can be a blast to be around. But when you're growing up with them, or if they're your main competition, then they can be absolutely infuriating, and I have experiences with that growing up as well, playing on sports teams, where you have the super cocky, overly arrogant guy that thinks he's God's gift to the world, and when maybe you're a little more introspective or nerdy than you trying to figure things out, you're just kind of staring there in disgust, and it's like, how does this work? Why do people like this?
Actually, it doesn't matter what you say, because in my head, I'm just hearing the crowd cheer my name after I scored a goal tonight. Jamie Tat, Jamie Tat,
But I'm not going to give a play-by-play of the book. I rather enjoyed it. I just want to highlight on a few parts that I really did enjoy. To start things out with, I wanted to start in an Aryan Academy, and there were 3 major points that I kind of want to talk about here. So firstly, it would have to be probably one of the more interesting choices I saw in this book, and that would be Tyndall's journey of seduction with the teachings of Sire Rose. I am re-recording a lot today, so rather than go on to a 5 to 10 minute loose rant about how the red pill has evolved since 2018 and the cringe state of pickup artistry today, and try to tie that back into Tyndall's character. I'm going to try to focus this back more on the book. I think going down the seduction path and trying to become like a Casanova type character really fits Tyndall's character. Up until now, he has always been brash and confident and more than willing to like boast and brag and be braggadocious and kind of that like knight in shining armor that will more than happily just go and tell you of his dragon slaying adventures and, you know, try to get into as many pants as can be possible. So with his established relationship with Pentandra, who studies this and is also another type of very lusty type of individual, then I think it's fitting that they get into more of the academic rhetoric for it, especially with Pentandra being a sex magician who studied it, with Tyndall wanting to become more competent at this in general. When I'm reading one of my favorite fantasy series, I forgot this was a thing, so I thought it was kind of hilarious to suddenly be brought up with a seduction manual and just kind of the idea of like brash teenagers trying to study this kind of codified seduction like a biography of Casanova and then running out in the world to implement. Not to mention, now that Tyndall is armed with it and he already had experience with women up until now, trying to pull young Rondel out of his type of rut and actually try to bring him into how to actually interact with women. I thought that was just kind of a hilarious type of dynamic because I have been in that dynamic in both Tyndall and Rondel's perspective, so it's something that I think a lot of guys go through, especially when they're younger and inexperienced. It's just, I think people at one point have been Tyndall and have been Rondel, and so then just suddenly getting smacked in the face of this as like that continuous like teenage coming of the age, it brought up a lot of kind of funny memories to me. Two, I like the expansion they went into certain types of magic systems, like when Tyndall realized he was very bad at magic and he started actually diving into like blue magic and stuff. I actually rather enjoyed that, the kind of exploration and the exposition of how the magic actually works. Even though it's a soft system, it's still really enjoyable once you start to dive like deeper into that stuff. And in Arian in general, like, you know, you find out that alchemists for the most part really wouldn't benefit from a witch stone because most of their stuff is kind of sourced materials and more of like a chemistry reaction. Now later on in the series, you find out that certain alchemists can actually benefit from having witch stones, but it's like little tiny details that you wouldn't have gotten like regardless. And the whole throwing the boys into like the magical academy, like we have done flashbacks kind of back to this place like with Menelin, but because we have been in Menelin's POV this whole time and he's had so many important things to like deal with, having him flash back to his like school days or like infantry war college days for no particular reason, I don't think would really serve the plot a lot. So taking the time to divert back into like here, I thought was pretty fun. There was a cool little expansion on the fundamentals of magic and how everything works that you wouldn't necessarily have gotten before.
Oh, back to school to prove to Dad that I'm not a fool.
And thirdly, I do think that setting up that in-between or just driving that wedge between Tyndall and Rondel with the death of Anastasia and just the general teenage pure communication, you know, shows that one, they're too immature to actually like deal with things seriously and actually like communicate together even though they're in the same circumstance. But I think that driving like Rondel into the war college was a pretty good move. Like, I think I relate the most to Rondel in this book specifically. So being dropped off all angsty into basically boot camp, I've done that before.
Sound off! Tell me right now, what is your freaking problem? Why can you not want to take me off your Get down! Get down! Get up! You better get down! You better get down! Get down!
So I related a lot to the next sequence, so I really did enjoy just kind of having that stake set up, having in the heat of the moment the brash, arrogant guy just letting his mouth say whatever, fly out, consequences be damned, and then having the more introspective guy, introverted guy, take it very seriously and then just cause a rift that the other guy just seems oblivious to. Just when you're pulling at emotions, it's just masterfully done. That leads us directly into the War College arc, which I think is probably my favorite arc of this book because it has the most progression in there. And in here we're in Rondel's PV. I like a few things that got set up here. One was seeing Rondel just kind of come onto its own, grow, fill, become confident in himself, because he was always a smart, studious person, and he had gone through so much experience. But unlike Tyndall, who took that straight to his ego in his head and became the brash, cocky knight, it's kind of a kick in the ass, or the strength of Raylan Core going through general boot camp to get some confidence and, you know, learn to rely in himself physically. Watching him go from timid to like a squad leader and getting the name of like Striker by just like bowling Tyndall over, I thought was a really fun time. There were like little bits in here too, which I actually really enjoy about like Ronald's character, where Tyndall is repeatedly through here saying like, you know, why didn't you stay and duel me, or why did you do things this way? And Ronald's continues analysis brain is always like, well, as much as that would have been satisfying, the mission was to do this. I'm not going to waste time on not the mission. So later on, when Ronald becomes an adept commander and stuff, and Tyndall becomes like an adept kind of charger, burst in, storm the gates type of character, you're seeing that divergence of character, which I thought was pretty cool. Having spent the entire time in Tyndall's POV for Anarian, and just kind of like the sheer arrogance and kind of him just constantly overlooking Rondel, and then the initial just Rondel trying to get over him getting blamed for the death of Anastasia, his own self-hatred, and now his growing loathing for Tyndall. You know, watching him start winning at the wand duel, winning the actual like sparring duels, the amount of satisfaction that you can grow off of that, I thought was well done. Tyndall had to like address kind of Rondel's growing strength and learn to respect him. I thought that was like a nice little twist. Getting into when they return from the War College with a little bit more respect for each other, they go directly into learning directly from Sire K about their chivalrous arts. I think the thing that I most enjoyed most about this part was kind of the diving into the lore of chivalry and kind of how the medieval structure works. It might be a bit nerdy, but I actually really enjoyed the differences between when would you serve wine versus beer versus spirits to courtly vassal and stuff, and diving more into like the medieval politics of the situation. It's something that I've always enjoyed about this series. You don't really see the boys grow as much or progress as much in this arc, but you do see them get a little more seasoning. Up until now, they've always been kind of mages. They've always been kind of sort of war mages. They've been fighting, studying, and doing that type of thing, but now they're doing something new. They're doing the Knights Magi, so having them go in there and kind of participate in errantry and seeing what the life of a knight could possibly look like, I thought was pretty fun, and gives them their own sort of twist and identity that really separates them away from Menelin. But not a lot to say during the errantry phase of this. A lot of rabbit jokes. A lot of rabbit jokes. And lastly, this wraps up the book by throwing them off together on a mission into enemy lines, trying to set up like a forward operating base. And at this point, you have the characters kind of resolved through all their issues for the most part, and they're actively working together and really just coming to terms with how similar and just how they can work well together as a unit. I really enjoyed Rondel's thrown into command situation where he is having to balance, you know, dealing with civilians, dealing with like a girl who is an absolute survivor that is trying to manipulate the situation the best way that she can, and them having to deal with the mystery and the betrayal and the deceit of all of that. And this was a part before where when I first picked up this book, I was furious that they let the girl go. To me, she was kind of escaping justice. But now on this reread, while I don't condone any of that, I can understand it a bit more. So I'm like less incensed reading at this point. When you're in that type of shitty situation, stuck in that type of social standing, it's something I can understand a bit more. For you Malazan fans, this was something I think that if I had read books 2 or 3 about like Felison earlier in life, I would have probably very much disliked Felison, rather than when I read it now and I understand the situation of just getting thrown in the worst possible deal at a young age and then having to deal and using whatever survival things you can and just continuously making bad decisions. I'm a bit more sympathetic to those type of characters now that I'm a bit older. But even though I am sympathetic to that, kind of that end sort of thing where like they finally address her and she tries to like flip the script on him and tell Tyndall that Rondel's been betraying him this whole time and trying to steal his position, a lot of satisfaction, and suddenly they got flipped back on her and she's like, why would I want his position when he's my commanding officer? I think in this phase is when you really see Tyndall's type of growth. Like, you know, they were getting along more and more in the Knight era and as he earned his respect in the War College, but at this point you're actually seeing why they would make such a good pair together and why they're so useful for men. They are running their own supply depots, they're kind of going off and doing this type of reconnaissance, and it was just kind of really fun to go into, just watching these characters who in the beginning you were so frustrated with because they couldn't do basic communication, were whining at every different corner rather than accepting responsibility. To run their own miniature war campaign was pretty cool to see, and I think this is why I enjoy the series a lot. The Spellmonger, I think you switch genres a lot of times in this, and different people are attracted to different things, but for me, at the heart of it, I've always really enjoyed the progression and the world building. So this book, you got a lot of progression because you went from terrible, annoying characters to grounded, mature commanders and soldiers and knights magi. And just the way this whole book like wrapped up, I thought was a pretty fun, good time. Like having it go back to Min's perspective here, the boys get a simple task to go off on their own, and they wind up starting their own knightly order to then conquer a domain and file it under their own type of domain rather than involve Menelin with it, showing their complete independence was just nicely done. I will say, I've heard before that some people say they just skipped to kind of like Rondel's arc and stuff, and I think that Rondel's POVs in this book were the stronger POVs in general. I still enjoy Tyndall as a character, but when you just have burgeoning, blossoming confidence, then, you know, learning to be a little more cautious is a less exciting arc than when you don't have any confidence and you slowly learn how to stand up for yourself and take that. I mean, to me, it's just the more compelling storyline. So I enjoyed both of them, but I think in this book, Rondel definitely was my favorite. But for this video, I'm not going to do a series spoiler tie-in. I think that this book did a lot of good just kind of expanding out in the world at large rather than foreshadowing the future. And other than just talking about kind of cool things that Tyndall and Rondel get up to, I think that instead I'll just save that for the next book and the next review. But like I said before, while I've seen a lot of criticism for this book where I think this is the most divisive book in the series, once again, I am a fan of the works, and take that with a grain of salt because I don't think there's necessarily a bad book that I remember reading in this. I'll have to get back to the Potential arcs to like definitely make sure, but I do remember enjoying them, just not as much as I did the Menelin arcs. But as we continue with this series, you're going to see those POVs switch kind of back and forth as more characters are adding in, and to me, that's a good thing. 30 books of Menelin making the same mistakes or doing the same things, I think would get old. So I do enjoy when you split different characters and learn a bit more about the world and situations that we definitely wouldn't have been able to do with our lovable main wizard character. But like I mentioned in one of my last videos, I am focusing on the Spellmonger this year, so hopefully I can get completely caught up by the end of the year, but I am a few books ahead of this as of recording this review, so expect some more shortly, and hopefully we can get all of the books done by the end of this year. As always, I appreciate you guys spending your time hanging out with me, and I hope you all take it easy.